Try third time lucky. Yes. Good evening. Good evening. Good evening. Welcome. It is so lovely to be with you. My name is Joanna Seaborn, of being the diocesan director. I'm going to take this moment to say, if you're sitting there thinking about doing an internship next year, it might be at St. George's, it might be at a church somewhere else across this area, then come and talk to me. I would love to share and talk with you. And you might be sitting there thinking, yeah, but I don't know, I know they do student interns, and I see them, and I see musical interns, but the gifts that I have, could that be an internship? Well, come and talk to me. We do a whole variety of internships, so I would love to share with you. If you're thinking, could God be asking me to give a year to growing as a disciple? Okay, so right, let's get into living well together. Thank you, Peter, for reading that reading to us tonight. And I want you to come with me back into that scene, that reading. There is a crowd around Jesus. There's a crowd around Jesus because his fame is growing. People have heard what he's doing. They've heard that he's been healing people. They have heard that he has raised somebody from the dead. They've heard that he calmed a storm. This is someone they want to hear more about. And so wherever Jesus is going, the crowds are following him. The crowd is pressing in around him. They don't want to miss, because often as Jesus walks along the road, he talks to the people around him, and the people don't want to miss it, and so they're crowding in. And in the midst of that crowd, there is a woman who is desperate to reach out and touch Jesus. She doesn't want to be noticed. She doesn't want to be seen, but she just needs to get close to Jesus. This is a woman who is physically exhausted, absolutely exhausted. She has been bleeding for 12 years. 12 years of feeling that intense exhaustion and draining when you're bleeding. But she's also emotionally exhausted. In Mark's account of this woman, it says that she has spent all her money on many doctors and none of them could help her. Can you imagine that ongoing kind of, could this doctor be the one that helps me? I will give him some money. And then the doctor can't. And the disappointment and the heartache. And then somebody hears of another doctor and she goes and she gives more money and they can't help. And then she hears over here and they can't help. Alongside feeling physically exhausted and emotionally, at that time, the religious laws meant that when a woman was menstruating, they were considered religiously unclean. And they weren't allowed to go into the temple courts. They weren't allowed to take part in the religious festivals because they were unclean. And anybody who touched them was considered unclean. Now, as for many Old Testament laws, it came from a good place because what it did was protect the woman at that point of time in the month from having to do things. It gave them a bit of space. It gave them a bit of protection. And yet, now it had got to the point where nobody would come anywhere near her for fear of being tainted. And she, for 12 years, had not been able to enter the courts of the temple. For 12 years, she'd not been able to take part in, those festivals, those high points of the year that encourage you spiritually and remind you why you have your faith. And she'd not been able to be part of that. This is a woman who's been excluded and left out. She's socially, physically, emotionally, spiritually exhausted, at her wit's end, but she's determined. She's heard of Jesus. If I can just reach out and touch this man, maybe just maybe. And she makes her way through the crowd. You can understand now why she doesn't want other people to know that she's there, because maybe they would stop her. They would try and protect Jesus from getting tainted because they think that might happen. And she reaches out and she grabs hold of the bottom of his robe, maybe the tassels that every good rabbi had on the bottom of his cloak. And as she reaches out, power goes from Jesus. Because Jesus' power isn't just a kind of, following him wherever he is. This is individual. His power goes from him to somebody. And he knows that power has gone out of him. And she receives healing, physical healing at that moment from Jesus. At that moment, Jesus turns and says one of those comedy things to his people around. He says to the disciples, "Who touched me?" And you can imagine them looking at him thinking, "Are you crazy? The crowd is pressing in around you. Hundreds of people are trying to touch you." And Jesus says, "No, somebody touched me." Because Jesus knew that more healing was needed for this woman, not just the physical healing. And so he waits and says, "Who?" And she, trembling, comes forward. The woman who has been silenced up till now and kept on the edge and kept at arm's distance. He brings her and acknowledges her in front of everyone. He creates a space for her voice to be heard. He listens to her story. He could have just said, "This woman touched me and power went out, and let me tell you, she is healed." No, he doesn't. He gives her voice. And when she shared her story, he calls her daughter. You notice that up till this point in the story, she is known by the thing that other people know about her, that she's been bleeding for 12 years. We don't know her name. And yet, what does Jesus call her? Daughter. Daughter. This is the one place in the New Testament where Jesus individually speaks to someone and says, "Daughter, your faith has made you well." This story comes at a point when actually Jesus had already been asked to go and heal somebody. In fact, an important person, Jairus, a leader in the synagogue, his daughter was ill. Now that was a great mission moment. A leader in the synagogue had come to Jesus, so they are on a mission to go and heal Jairus' daughter. And the servants are coming saying, "Hurry, Jesus, hurry. She is really ill. You've got to get there." This is not the time to be interrupted. This is not the time to stop and listen to somebody else's need, but this woman is determined. And Jesus stops and listens. He creates space. This woman had been determined. I wonder how many others on that day needed healing. How many others on that day had felt on the edge, had felt they couldn't be part of that crowd, and didn't have the determination of that woman? Or maybe thought, that little girl who's ill, she's more important than me. Jesus is too busy. I won't bother him. I'll stay. I'm not important. How many people didn't reach out to Jesus that day and missed out on the healing that woman received? How many were too fearful that the crowd would have rejected them and pushed them away? Over these weeks, we have been looking at a number of pastoral principles that help us as a community to relate well to each other. We've been looking at how these pastoral principles also help us to relate to those who feel on the edge. And today we're looking at silence. Now, silence can be good. That time of stillness and quietness. That time when we manage to switch off from the constant media and the phone goes on silent and even kind of gets hidden away so that we can be still and silent and listen to the God who loves to communicate with us. That's good silence. But there's also bad silence. The silence that stops us talking about things that matter. The silence that stops other people sharing what they need to share. The silence that keeps people at arm's distance. Now, I have the amazing privilege of being a mum to a 5-year-old boy. What that actually means is that we currently have many, many conversations about what it's appropriate to talk about in public. Recently, we went for dinner with some friends. He chose that moment to sing a song that he had made up about poo. He sang it with great gusto. Every other word was poo. And actually, he would like to be talking about bodily functions, it feels like, in many situations. And so we're having the conversation about when it's appropriate and when it's not appropriate to talk about poo. But I wonder, there are many of us who've grown up being told what it's appropriate to talk about in church and with those around us, and what it's not appropriate to. Maybe we've been told it, or we've just assumed it, or we've felt it, or we've never heard anybody else talk about it, and so we assume we need to be silent about that. We shouldn't talk about what we spend our money on. That's a private thing. We shouldn't talk about politics and who we vote for. We shouldn't talk about the challenge of periods and how it impacts our energy levels and our emotions. We shouldn't talk about the menopause. Like, that's just not appropriate, is it? We shouldn't talk about our sexuality and how it impacts on our identity. So many areas that we decide are no-go areas. But Jesus is interested in every area of our lives. There are no-go areas with Jesus. He longs for us to bring every part of who we are before him. He longs for us to bring the things we wrestle with, the things we're confused about, the things we're not sure about, into his presence. And he longs to meet us, to create the space for us to share and talk and hear our voice. And Jesus is the one who meets us, sometimes with healing, where we bring that which is broken, sometimes with challenge, where we bring something that he says, hang on a minute, sometimes with comfort, often with a mix of it all. But he wants to hear our voice. When we send out the message that there are things we don't talk about, when there are things that are off limit, then we also limit our welcome to those who are feeling like, if I come in there, I have to hide a part of me. I have to pretend. Do we send that message to people? I think we send it in a number of different ways. We can send it by saying, it's not appropriate. We can send it by simply not talking about things ourselves. We can send it by being too busy to stop and really listen and give people the chance to share. Interestingly, there is a conjecture that the women at the time that we're talking about now, this evening, would have probably created their own little community. When they couldn't go into the courts, they probably created this community that would encourage one another and share with one another and support one another. And the truth is that if we don't create space within our community, people will find other groups to share and to talk. And those groups can be incredibly helpful and encouraging and supportive. But those groups are not going to point to Jesus, the one who has the power to heal, the one who has the power to look into the eyes of that woman and say, "Daughter, you are not rejected. You are not on the edge. You are not unwelcome. Daughter, draw near and know the healing power of the risen Lord Jesus." Those groups on the edge will support and encourage, but we have the unique calling to point to Jesus. The woman was determined and courageous. And Jesus looked at her and said, "Woman, your faith has made you well." Because her courage meant she persevered to get to Jesus. Are there people that we need to help to get to Jesus, who on that day needed the crowd to make way, who needed to be reassured and encouraged? Jesus wants to listen. Jesus was the one who made space and didn't silence her voice, but gave her a voice again in the community. She went away knowing healing within herself and healing in her community that she'd never known before. So I wonder tonight, as you hear this story again of this woman who reached out, I wonder if there are areas of your life that you have felt afraid to bring before the Lord Jesus. Areas of our lives that we've been too embarrassed to talk about. Or areas where we've felt silenced by others. Jesus invites us to draw near. He invites us. He invites us to speak of every part of who we are and to hear him speak into every part of who we are. To bring his healing and his comfort, his challenge. As a church, we are called to be a community who listen deeply to each other. And I wonder if for some of us, we need to say sorry for the times we've silenced others simply by our busyness and not being willing to stop and listen and hear. Or by giving the impression that we don't talk about that in polite company. Actually, it's deep, and it's difficult, and it hurts. And we can be those people that make a space and point to Jesus and say he's interested, and he cares, and he welcomes. So we need to ask God for those opportunities to make space for others around us, to share and to listen. The woman came to Jesus and discovered deep healing within herself. May we be a community where we know that healing as we come to Jesus, and where we make space for others to come in and discover the welcome of Jesus, who welcomes each of us and longs to hear us, to give us voice, and to speak to us. Shall we stand together?